Welcome back, viewers, to another Lucid Poker video. It's Texas Tommy here, and here are 5 spots to c-bet your entire range. We've got ourselves a little button raise, big blind defend, and the board comes ace, ace, ace. Now we're going to explain why this is a range c-bet. Use this board because it's nice and clean and neat, and so hopefully this can go some way to explaining why some of the other boards will also be a range c-bet. But this is going to be, I think, visually the easiest to hopefully comprehend for some of the guys. So as you can see, big blind checks their entire range, and as the button, we c-bet our entire range. Every single hand here bets this 30%. But let's talk about why this is. So I want you, dear viewers at home, to focus in on the filters here. Think about the quads and think about the full houses. We have 27% of a range being a full house plus, and then on top of that, we have king highs, 24% of the range, and we have nothing, 49% of the range. If we put in our bet and we have a look at our opponent's range, you can see 60% of the range is nothing, 20% of the range is king high, and then the full houses, weaker full houses, and then 8% of the range is quads. Now, in particular, the quads is very influential in terms of what's happening here. Quads are obviously a basically indestructible hand. Okay, in theory, there's a tiny little potential for a straight flush draw out there, but you know, to all intents and purposes, we can just say every time you got quads, you're winning this hand, you're pretty much invulnerable. So that dictates a lot of what's happening in theory. Now, because of the button's increase in quad representation on this flop, what happens is we see the big blind overfolding. Now, how do we know the big blind's overfolding here? Think about the button. So the button's betting 30% of the range. Now, for those of you who like your minimum defense frequencies, we're going to put an upswing article, I think, in the description here to talk about if you're interested in more minimum defense frequencies. But suffice to say, if the big blind it faces a 30% c-bet, to prevent the button from properly betting any 2 cards, they would have to defend somewhere between 25 to 20% of the range. As you can see, the big blind here is folding 46% of the range, which is a massive overfold given the minimum defense frequency that should be happening. What this means in theory, let's say you're playing the situation on the button. You look down and instead of seeing playing cards, you saw 2 jokers. Now your jokers didn't mean anything. You were going to lose the hand if you get the showdown. You still would be more profitable betting this hand with no hope of winning because you're risking 30% and you're going to win the pot almost 54% of the time. Your 1.5 big blind risk, if you like, that you're taking is still going to outperform checking even when you wouldn't have cards here. Like, I know that sounds kind of strange, but imagine you had 2 napkins or you had baseball cards or whatever. You didn't have anything that connects with the board, you're still profitable. So hopefully it makes sense when you have nothing, when you have a king high, you're very incentivized to bet here. Now you're less perhaps incentivized to bet your quads. It may make sense. Why would I want to bet my quads if I'm going to get overfolds? Quads is a really good hand. Why don't I check, let my opponent catch up? Now, if you're playing a non-professional, for example, you may be incentivized to do that. Let's say you're playing in a home game with your buddies and they don't really know poker and they don't really understand things. You may not want to bet your 4 of a kind on this kind of flop. But from a theoretical point of view, when we think about the pros and cons of what's happening here, 73% of your range is really incentivized to bet. In fact, actually a bit more than that when you include some of the weaker hands, in terms of they really gain EV by generating overfolds. And so it's better to make a significant gain with 70, 80% of your range compared to, and then be accepting of a little bit of a loss with 10% of your range, compared to trying to maximize the EV with 10% of your range at the expense of 90% of your range. You have to have a form of balance in your strategy in equilibrium poker, because of course, if we did something different, in theory, it'd be very exploitable, right? If we only check quads here, we're not going to get any action anyway, right? If you only check quads, your opponent's just going to check fold range on turn. So then you say, well, I'll start checking some nothing, but then suddenly you start eating into it. So I hope that makes some degree of sense why we are betting range on this kind of board. And I hope that range advantage, and in particular, the range advantage equaling an overfolding from the big blind, goes some way to demonstrate just why we would be range betting this flop. The number 1 burst flop type where you should be betting your range, most of the time if the board is trips, you're going to be hard pressed to find a spot where you're not going to be range betting. We'll take a 4-4-4 for example, we get close to a range bet. Let's take an 8-8-8 for example, we get a range bet. Let's take a Jack-Jack-Jack, we get a range bet. So you can see that trips is going to be your first board type. Not tons of trips, of course. They represent what, 14 flops, less than 1% of all the flops you face. Nevertheless, flop trips, good idea, range c-bet. Spot number 2, and related to the trips board types, is going to be paired boards, but with one caveat. So we saw with the trips, most trip boards are just going to be range bets, and let's take a kind of blank ace-6 board, and we'll check, and we see basically a range bet. In general, this is a Texas Thomas top tip. If you're seeing board types which have, 90% plus as their betting strategy, it's probably a good idea just to range bet those. You don't need to try and work out some incredibly complex 10% or 4% or 6% checking range with a very specific set of hands. If you're playing good opponents and you're trying to emulate a theoretical equilibrium strategy, you're more likely actually to make bigger deviations by implementing a check-in range on this kind of board than just by betting range. Betting range is, already 98% theoretically correct, and there isn't a single hand here that is that disincentivized to bet. You're not going to see an EV mistake with any of your hands here. So we're going to see range bets on most paired boards, but there was a caveat that we mentioned. Today, a king 6, for example, we're going to see likewise similarly high bet, range bet here. However, let's have a quick think about the big blind and think about the buttons ranges. We talked about on the trips boards how the very strongest hands dictate a lot of the action that happens in theoretical poker. We saw in the ace that having the quads advantage was pretty significant, that caused an overfolding and therefore allowed us to over-realize and deny a lot more equity, and was one of the main drivers for range betting. If we think about the pre-flop ranges that are happening here, we can see that there are certain board types where the big blind has a bit of an advantage. So you can see that the button, for example, opens very little 7x. They open lots of suited 7x, but offsuit wise doesn't open any 7x. From the big blind, we can see some offsuit 7x defending, the 8-7. We can see lots of 5x suited defending. And so a board type, my guess is going to be, this is not research by the way, we'll see if I'm correct, a board type like a 6-6-5, a 7-7-5, something in those situations is unlikely, in my opinion, to be a range bet. So let's try it. Now my suggestion is, and we're already seeing a donk by the way happening here, which is another little factor. We check, we see just a 60% betting range. Now why is this? Once again, we'll go to the strongest hands. You can see that the button here has just 4% of the hands being trips plus. We look at the big blinds and they've got 6% of the range being trips plus. Now we talked before about how having that range advantage allows you to deny equity and allows you to often over-realize post-flop. If we take the button and we make them bet 30%, we see that what was previously on our ace board was like 48% folding or something, has now shrunk a lot to just 32%. On top of that, the big blind actually has donking strategies here, and so if they were to donk, they don't quite achieve the required MDF in terms of the button can still defend a lot. Naturally, being in position, by the way, is something where you're going to just in general realize more equity, and so typically you're less likely to reach those MDF thresholds betting out of position compared to betting in position. But nevertheless, we can see it's a spot where, because we're a lot closer to that minimum defense frequency, that the big blind is able to realize we're therefore just gaining a lot less when we think about the buttons over realizing we're at the bottom of the range, and because of that they want to start working in some checks with that, and then suddenly those checks, you have hands that are very incentivized to check at the bottom of the range, you can have hands that are very incentivized to check at the top of the range. Hopefully that makes sense. Board type number 2, paired boards, with the caveat when you have a trips advantage in your range as the pre-flop raiser compared to the big blind's range as the big blind defender. If they have trips advantage, those are not range bet boards. Board type number 3 is going to be king high disconnected board. We're going to pick a king 8-3 rainbow here. We're going to check and we see the 99%, I'm going to call it a range bet, dear viewers, that's happening as a c-bet from the button here. Once again, we can look and think about the strongest hands that we have here. So if we focus on our top pair plus, 16, 18, 20% of a range, put the bet in and we have a look at the big blind and look at their top pair plus, it's just 14% of the range. We focus on the very strongest hands, which would be like the over pairs plus, 5% of our range is going to be aces or better. Again, we focus on the big blind and we focus on the over pairs plus, just 2% of the range. So we have 2.5 times more the very top end. And once again, what we're going to see is a bit of an overfolding happening from the big blind in terms of the minimum defense frequency. Again, something that really incentivizes a lot of our range to bet, both for value and for bluffs, although try not to get too, I think a very common mistake that a lot of beginner poker players have is that on flops, on these range flop bets, they have a question, well, why am I betting queen 10? It's not as a bluff, it's not as a value, I don't expect my opponent to fold better, etc, etc. Denying equity is really useful. Both denying equity, both preventing your opponent from giving the opportunity to bluff on later streets. If you check and then they probe with some equity, etc, etc, you may not be able to defend queen 10. It's a profitable bet to make with most of your hands here. And not only that, but like, it's a very balanced strategy. So by betting your strong hands and by betting your weak hands, the big blind hasn't got any possible recourse in terms of how to more optimally beat your strategy than just by betting range. Something to think about. Okay, so here's another board, the king jack 10, and we have the big blind checking their entire range, and we have the button almost range betting this board, 94%. If you were to in-game range bet this, it's probably not a bad idea. Once again, when we think about the properties of this hand type, so when we think about the best hands possible, again, we'll focus on the top pair plus for the button, and you can see a multitude of strong hands here. So top pairs, over pairs, two pairs, sets, and straights. Straights in particular, I think, are very interesting. The ace, queen, and queen nine represent 7%, but not only that, but the absolute nuts represents 3.5% of our range is ace, queen in this little spot here. Really, really important. And combine that with the sets that we have here, very, very important, 9% of range, and two pair even, let's go with that, 15% of range being two pair plus, gives us quite a healthy range advantage. Again, if we check the big blind, we look for the two pair plus, top pair, sorry, we see just 9% of the range, and we see just 4% of the range being the straight. So they don't have ace queen off in their range, and that has a big impact about why we're range c-betting this kind of board. Now, if we were to pick a different kind of board, funny enough, we would pick a hand like ace jack 10, we'd probably see a reduction in the betting, because then our opponent actually would have an equal amount, or would have a good representation of straights in the range. So Texas Tomo's top prediction, king jack 10 will be more c-bet than ace jack 10. Let's see if we're correct. Yes, we're correct. And you can see that the straights, king queen off, which of course are a big part in this, our opponent actually also has king queen off in this case. Now, fewer straights, of course, we still see a decent amount of betting on this board, but relative to the king jack 10, we see much more c-betting from the button. And again, this should be a good spot to potentially bet your entire range, especially if you are playing an opponent that is under check raising, is overfolding slightly, etc, etc. And so if someone, for example, isn't check raising some of their queen x, maybe they're playing more passively, maybe they're not check raising some of their ace x, good opportunity for you to over-realize equity on that front as well. Okay, and for our final range c-bet spot, we're actually going to move into the world of 3-betting. Now, we did all the other ones in single race pots, and hopefully some of the concepts were made concrete in terms of why we want to range bet certain boards. In 3-bet, the same concepts apply, but of course the ranges are slightly different. Typically in a 3-bet situation, ranges are a bit stronger from the 3-better, but they're also stronger from the button that raises and calls. In this case, we're going to do a big blind versus button 3-bet, and we picked a very specific board. We're going to pick the queen jack 10 rainbow. Now, some of you at home may be able to guess why this will be a range bet board, but if we were once again to focus on the very top of our range and we think about the sets and straights and two pairs, but particularly the sets and straights, and let's say over pairs plus, this ace king looms large in terms of the combinatoric impact it has. 15% of our range is a straight here. Does the button flat a 3-bet with ace king? The answer is no. Ace king off, certainly not. So when we c-bet our ace king here, our opponent, now whereas the big blind, the button opponent has just 5% of the range being straights and a very small frequency being the ace king, the super important hands. It's a really good idea in most situations. This is a good Texas Tomo's top tip from Theory Poker. At every single street you're on, think about who has the nuts. Think about which range has more of the nuts, and that has a big influence in terms of dictating the action and the strategies that you take in theoretical poker and in real poker too. When an opponent's range has far more nuts, it's very difficult for that range not to over-realize overall EV, because their weaker hands get to, quote, bluff more effectively. The other range's weaker hands has to typically overfold slightly. Again, if we look to here and we take a look at the c-betting range, let's bet 25% here. Being in position, we're seeing a little bit of an increase in the defending range, but again, 27% is too much of an overfold in terms of we're over-realizing EV. With the weakest parts of the range, we're still getting value, of course, as well. That's something else to think about, right? You're still going to make chips when you have the nuts, even if you get overfolds, because, of course, 75% of the time, 73% of the time in this case, you're still getting calls, right? So it's still worth building a pot a bit. Queen jack 10, lots of boards like this, by the way. To give another example, in a 3-bet pot, similar applications apply that we talked about in the single race pots. So here we see the king 7-2, close to range c-betting. We actually see that a bit bigger because, again, of the range interactions. The button range is a bit more condensed and has a bit more, let's say, equity on these type of boards than that big blind defending range does. And so there are some range versus range implications here. But in general, those are 5 board types that I think are good to range bet, both in theoretical poker, but also in practical poker too. Hopefully range betting those boards will help you, and hopefully some of the theory that goes into behind why we're betting some of these boards will help you actually learn to not range c-bet in some other situations. If we take this 3-bet pot, for example, when you think about the ranges, very easy, for example, to think of an ace-high board being really good for a range. In fact, often not quite the case. If we take a dry ace 7-2, very easy to think, oh, I must range bet this board. Actually, you'll see we're checking almost over a third of the time. And again, when we think about a top pair plus, it's going to be well represented in both ranges, so there isn't such a range advantage here. We can see 29% of the range in the button and for 29% for the big blind too. And so without that big top end advantage, we don't range bet, but on the boards where we do have that big range advantage, we do range bet. Hopefully that all made sense. Lucid Poker is available, of course, if you'd like, and you're welcome to give the channel a follow, a like, a subscribe, a dislike, an unsubscribe, a hateful comment, all warmly appreciated. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.